So we give a little bit of a broad view on the issue. So people have these discussions. There are national policymakers, international development organization representatives, practitioners, and also a representative of an indigenous group. And they will provide responses to the presentation. And of course, we would like to invite you, the audience, to provide comments and questions. And there will be also something, some online tool called Slido ready for you. And in a minute, you will get explanations for that. In this thing, you have to choose discussion forum 16. That's what I'm reading here. So today's moderator will be actually my colleague, Kartika Juniwati from Indonesia. Where is she here? And she is a lecturer for development economics in the University of Indonesia and also a research associate at CIFOR. And she will introduce you to the Slido thing and also to the panelists. And so I'm going to hand over to her at this point. Thanks for being here, and I look forward to a really interesting and lively session.
Okay, this is too high for me, so I will stand here instead. Okay, thank you very much, Christopher. I'll start with introduction about Slido.com. So for those of you who have some questions, you can go to slido.com, and then you put the code GLF Bond 2018, and then choose our discussion forum with the red dot. It's called Managing Migration and Remittances for Environmentally Sustainable and Socially Responsive Landscape. And then please put your questions, and then to whom you targeted the question to. And also, while there, it said like the name is anonymous, is optional, but we would like to know you, basically. So this also, the tools can be used for those who are here and also those who are following us online with the streaming. So, and also another one, we have also already maybe in your tables like list of participants. We want to know you, so please fill in so for us to maybe for future reference or contact. Thank you very much and enjoy the session. Now we start with the video.
मेरो नाम सीता परियार हो के रे अनि त्यसपछि उमेर 29 वर्षै भयो श्रीमान कतारतिर हुनुहुन्छ नानी छ बाबु छ नानीले 11 वर्ष बाबुले 6 वर्ष बिहान 5:30 बजे उठ्छु कहिले त 6 बजे आज त 5:30 बजे उठेँ अनि बिहान उठ्ने घरको कामहरु गर्ने बाख्रा सार्ने कुँडो पकाएर दिने घरहरु लिप्ने बढार्ने भाडा धुने बच्चाहरुलाई खाजा बनाएर खुलाउने अनि त्यसपछि फेरि अब खाना बनाउने तिनीहरुलाई कपाल कोर्दिने ड्रेस लगाइदिने अनि स्कुल पुर्याउन जाने अनि एकछिन समय भयो भने घाँस काट्ने बाख्रालाई घाँस काट्यो अनि त्यसपछि फेरि मेला गए मेलामा अब अहिलेसम्म यहाँ भन्दा अगाडि त अब कोदो रोपाइ चलिरहेको थियो अहिले चाहिँ अब कोदो रोपाइ सकियो अहिले चाहिँ धान रोप्ने काम चल्दैछ अब घरमा धेरै खर्चहरु भयो बिरामी भयो अनि त्यसपछि गाउँ बसेर अलिअलि कमाएकोले केही गर्नै सकिएन अनि त्यसपछि ऋणहरु धेरै भयो तिर्न सकिन्छ कि भनेर जान त ऋणैमा थियो के रे भए पनि ऋण तिरेर कतै पहिलाकोहरु घटाउन सक्ने आफ्नो घर परिवारमा कतै अलि सुख शान्ति आउँछ कि भनेर नै पठाएको के रे अब आफ्नो जग्गा भन्दाखेरि त अब आफ्नो लालपुरजमा त एउटा घर पनि छैन के रे हामी उही यो घरहरु पनि त्यतिकै अब लालपुर बिना लालपुरजमै बसेको हो अनि अध्यय जग्गा गर्छु मैले पहिला 7-8 हलको गर्थे श्रीमान हुँदा अहिले चाहिँ मैले गरेँ होइन 10 बजे 10:30 बजे हिँडिन्छ बेलुका 6 बजे छुटेर घर आउँछौँ जेलाको कुरा त अब 225 हो अब गए पनि त कमाइ राम्रो भएन कम्पनी राम्रो परेन नबुझिकन अब धेरै त्यता कतै नहिँडेको मान्छे जानुभएको अनि नबुझिकन जानले गरेर 3 महिना जति त ड्युटी पनि पाउनु भएन अनि काममै लाग्नु भएन सेलरी पनि दिएन अनि त्यस्तै भएर बस्नुभयो अनि त्यसपछि अनि अलिअलि दियो अनि अहिले चाहिँ ठिकै छ उहाँको 1000 रुपैयाँ जति दिन्छ त्यही माथि खानी लाउने हामीलाई महिनाको उहाँको 700-800 जति पठाइदिनुहुन्छ त्यत्रो ऋण गरेर गएपछि हामी के गरेर तिर्ने हाम्रो बच्चा कसरी पढाउने हामीलाई त कति दुःख भयो अब त्यत्रो पैसाको ब्याज तिर्नु पर्यो अलिकति हुन्छ कि भनेर जाँदाखेरि झन् त्यस्तो समस्या भयो अब सक्ने युवा केटाहरू चाहिँ अब विदेश जाने भन्नुहुन्छ हैन अब विदेश गएपछि अब घरमा अब नसक्ने बाबाआमाहरू मात्रै हुनुहुन्छ जग्गाहरू त अब लगभग जोत्ने मान्छे पाइँदैन अब जोत्ने मान्छे नै नपाएपछि त काम गर्ने कुरै हुँदैन अब हामीहरूले गर्ने काम त ठिकै छ गर्छौँ यताउता परमेश्वरमा लाउँछौँ दिदीबहिनी मिल्छौँ गर्छौँ नि त जुन भने जोत्ने मान्छे नै पाइँदैन मैले भन्दैछु अब 1 वर्ष पुग्न लाग्यो ठिकै छ सेलरी बढाउँछ भरि बस्नु नत्र भने त्यति गएको ऋणहरू तिर्नु त्यसपछि आउनु गाउँमै बसेर दुःख गरे नि गरौँला नत्र भने अन्तै अर्कै मेन पावरमा गएर अलि राम्रो ठाउँमा अब त जान्यो बुझियो नि त त्यसो गरेर अन्तै जानु होला भनेछु यस्तै हो पढाइ लेखाइ छैन बुढा जहाँ गए पनि उही लेबर कामै हो ठिकै छ अब त्यति सुख पाएर बसौँला जस्तो त लाग्दैन के अरे है दुःख सुख चल्छ नै व्यवहार अब 5-10 वर्षपछि राम्रो काम चलेछ श्रीमानले कमाउन सक्नुभयो भने चाहिँ सुखै पाइएला के नत्र भने यतिकै होला नि
Even that is too high for me. Okay, thank you. Migration and remittance are gaining remarkable attention globally. The 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development is being widely celebrated for recognizing the crucial role that migration can play in advancing sustainable development for the first time. Migration and remittance-related targets are sprinkled across the SDGs, but they are particularly visible in goal number 10 on reducing inequalities within and among countries, and goal number 17 on strengthening means of implementation and revitalizing the global partnership for sustainable development. The SDGs reflects the ubiquity of migration in contemporary era, that migration can take diverse forms, from internal to international, from temporary circular to permanent displacement. There are multiple drivers of migration, from economic, social, to political. Migration can be voluntary or forced, and hence, managing migration so as to take advantage that the opportunities that migration offers, and to safeguard against the risk that it poses is the key. The objective of today's panel will bring together policymakers, practitioners, and advocates to have a conversation around how the cutting-edge research on migration and sustainable development can leverage for policymaking, advocacy, and practice. We will also discuss how researchers can learn about the issues that are most pressing concerns for policy, practice, and advocacy communities, so that these concerns are reflected in future research. The emphasis will be on using the concrete examples of research underway in different geographies and on varying issues related with migration and sustainable development. We will hear the perspective from policymakers and practitioners who are battling with questions about managing migration every day, whether it is for improved economic well-being or for greater political stability. So today, we already have our presenters. Please welcome here to the stage Fraser Sugden, Peter Kronkleton, and Charles Martin Seal. Sorry if I pronounce it wrong. Take a seat, please. Okay. Fraser is a senior lecturer in human geography at the University of Birmingham. Before joining Birmingham University, Fraser was a senior researcher at the International Water Management Institute in Kathmandu, where he was also the country representative for Nepal. Fraser is one of the founding members of the MARIS Network, Migration, Agriculture and Resilience Initiative for Sustainability. Peter is a senior scientist at the Center for International Forestry Research. He is an anthropologist that has spent the past 20 years conducting research on smallholder forestry, rural livelihood, and forest policy in Amazon, Central America, and several countries in Africa. A recurring focus of his work has been on property right and the land use behavior of rural migrants on forest frontier in the Amazon. Charles is a researcher at the German Development Institute. He is a political scientist focusing on the role of technology and digitalization in migration and forced displacement, and cover both developing countries, including among urban migrants in Bogota and Nairobi, as well as migration between industrialized countries. So let me start. First from Fraser. Fraser, can you tell us about your research on large-scale out-migration for employment purpose?
They'll be opening them. They're going to open the presentation.
The presentation, please. This one?
Yeah,
yes.
great, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to start off today just talking in sort of broader terms about labour migration. So in spite of the quite well-justified academic and policy focus, particularly on the refugee crisis and enforced displacement worldwide, it's easy to overlook the fact that the vast majority of global migration is basically for labour. So I mean, most of this migration itself is actually internal migration. So there's 740 million internal migrants globally versus 244 million estimated international migrants. And a third of this internal migration is just in China alone, but then it also includes the vast sort of east-west migration in India from the kind of labour supplying eastern states to the sort of western cities and southern cities. There's also, if you look at international migration itself, is also another thing which is often easy to overlook, is the fact that the vast majority of international migration, is actually within the global south itself. In terms of the official figures, I mean, there's officially 90.2 million international migrants who have moved from within the globe from one southern country to another southern country, versus sort of 85.3 million who've migrated from the south to the north. But then, of course, this is likely to be significantly higher if one considers the fact that there's also a vast amount of unregulated movement across national borders. So this includes, migration of labour across borders, such as the border from Nepal to India, as shown in this picture here. This is the train line which runs across the Nepal-India border. There's a vast amount of migrants. They estimate around 800,000, possibly. Our Nepalis are living within India, and even that's likely to be higher just due to the problem of estimation. So this migration has increased significantly over the last 2 decades. I mean, if you look at international migration alone, there's a 63% increase in international migration between 2000 and 2015, and that continues to rise. And of course, there's no way of really monitoring how internal migration, but it's likely also to have increased at a similar rate. And this, of course, has long-term implications for the agricultural sector, as well as for natural resource management, and of course for the management on climate change adaptation. And many rural development policies and climate change sort of adaptation policies have actually kind of really failed to catch up with this huge transformation in rural areas. It's important to note, and I'll go on to next, is to say that the nature of this sort of labour migration is also changing, and this also has significant policy implications. So if you go back, like 150 years to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, so the great labour migrations which took place during the Industrial Revolution, they were very, very somewhat different from the kind of labour migration you see today. They represented a total break from the land. This is because migration was essentially a byproduct of the proletarianization of the peasantry and the development of capitalist agriculture. So farmers essentially were completely displaced from the land or forced off the land. They migrated to cities with their families. They created new lives in the cities. But the upshot of this was that with the new lives in the cities, wages began to rise and welfare systems emerged to support this new labouring population, which needed to reproduce itself. What you're seeing in many countries in the global south today, particularly in regions such as South Asia, is that farmers are actually, they're not making a complete break from the land. They're increasingly moving into a dual livelihood strategy because they're in a situation where neither agriculture nor migrant labour can support an entire family. So they're driven into this dual livelihood strategy by, of course, agrarian stress in the countryside itself, but also the fact that within cities the cost of living is rising to prohibitive levels, and then labour is becoming increasingly casualised, moving into low-wage, uncontracted sectors, which means it's very, very difficult for a family from somewhere in rural Nepal to migrate to a city and bring their whole family with them, just because it's prohibitively expensive. So this is actually emblematic of a much deeper set of structural inequalities within the global economy, whereas agriculture, in effect, is subsidising the low-wage economy of many countries within the global south. This takes place because the migrants who are working in these countries, in these sort of centres of accumulation overseas, as well as the migrants who are moving to cities within their home countries, essentially the wages are only supporting the cost of the migrant themselves. They don't have to cost the migrant's family. They don't have to cover the cost of the migrant's family, the cost of their schooling for their children, the cost of maintaining the older generation. And also, as you saw in that video earlier on, when people get old, when they retire, it's not the responsibility of the urban economy or cities or the urban wages to maintain the older population. They basically go back to the villages, and it's the rural economy, it's agriculture, which essentially picks up the tab for rural migrants when they retire. So what does this mean for development research? Well, I think there's a strong and quite justified focus in a lot of development research on the migrants themselves, but there really is actually a need to better understanding what's happening back home in the source communities. This is because it's very much a two-way driver of change. You have a changing agroecological and political economics context in rural areas, which is mediating the outflow of migration, where simultaneously migration itself is creating new stresses in rural areas, as also shown in the video earlier on, particularly such as through the labour crisis. Although it can, of course, in some contexts, create opportunities for agriculture. And really what the priority should be is to capture some of these opportunities, but also minimise some of the stress behind the migration process. So to start off with a bit more on the Nepal case, following on from the video earlier on. In Nepal, there's approximately 500,000 migrants per year who go to the Gulf states, as well as to Malaysia. But then there's also a vast undocumented seasonal and long-term migration to India, as I mentioned earlier, just under 1 million estimated. The last estimate was about 800,000, but it's likely to be higher since those figures came out. And this exponential rise in migration has particularly taken place over the last 10 years. So villages which saw no migration 15 years ago are suddenly at a situation where nearly every household has 1 or 2 family members outside. And this is really emblematic of the structural inequality at home, combined with the pressures of climate change and a liberalised economy. And many of the changes in Nepal are, of course, emblematic in other parts of the world where we've done research, such as in East Africa and India and in China. And the drivers really are a complex fusion of both biophysical, economic and cultural changes. So let's talk a bit more about the drivers. Well, of course, climate stress does play a role, although I will emphasize it's not the only role, but it does play a role in contributing to migration. You know, agriculture is increasingly unreliable, monsoons are unpredictable, there's increasingly poor returns on investment, and the cost of irrigating the land is often prohibitively expensive. But then there's also very, very strong economic pressures as well, which is driving that out migration, from Nepal. So this is the Chirkawa Valley in Bhojpur district in eastern Nepal. In this area, with the expansion of roads over the last 10 years, there's been a staggering rise in the cost of living. This has seen the destruction of cottage industries. So people who used to get goods through the barter economy now have to buy them in the market. There's also a rise in consumer culture perpetuated by the media, by social media. And then there's also changing food habits. With the expansion of roads, there was suddenly imported rice was flooding these local markets, and people actually started turning away from traditional foodstuffs and buying rice instead. And of course, it's remittances which has to cover the costs. Then there's weak terms of trade for agriculture. The cost of agricultural inputs is rising. People are receiving very, very poor returns for their investments. Holdings are getting smaller with population growth. Then this is again coupled with persisting inequality. Again shown in the video, a significant portion of farmers are tenants. In this village in Bodha and Morang in the eastern Terai of Nepal, around 80% of the farmers essentially are tenant farmers. They don't own their own land. And then at the same time, there's changing aspirations for youth. Youth no longer, this is a kind of a cultural, migration has become an end in itself also for cultural reasons. Young people don't want to remain in agriculture anymore. And this message, of course, of kind of modern lifestyles drives people into the migrant labour force, even if it appears to not make much economic sense. So what does this mean for those who actually stay behind? As I mentioned, agrarian stress is actually worsened by people for those who stay behind. So agriculture, of course, is increasingly becoming the female domain. There's feminization of agriculture, a significant labour burden for women. There's new vulnerabilities for those who stay behind. For example, the irrigation sector has long been a male-dominated sector. Women are increasingly not able to access irrigation resources after the men leave because they lack access to social networks, for example, or loans to get irrigation resources. There's an intensification of inequalities, an increase in debt as a result of migration, people taking loans to fund the migration process itself. And then you have institutional breakdown. Irrigation systems are falling apart because there's not enough people to maintain them in the committees. So briefly on the policy priorities, firstly, there's the issue of, remittance-based economies are emblematic of the structural underdevelopment in the global economy. But there is a need for caution at assuming remittances are a path to economic development. That isn't to say that there are opportunities to possibly mobilize remittances and create the incentives for people to use remittances effectively. There's also a need to there's also a need for policies to support farmers to adapt to demographic stress as well as to climatic stress. So, for example, through investing in mechanization, for example, to cope with the labor shortages, and also awareness of changing gender and generational roles. So, for example, awareness of the fact that certain technologies may be more appropriate for certain social groups. And also engage with youth to harness the positive feedback loops. So just a brief example, this is in Ethiopia where young people are being given out land as part of a land restoration process to try and encourage them to create the incentives for them to remain in the agricultural economy. Just go on briefly, last slide here on SDG 19, Action to Combat Climate Change. Outmigration can worsen vulnerability for those who stay behind. It can worsen their vulnerability to climate stress. But it can also reduce the incentive for people to invest in climate-smart technologies, because there's the idea that, if I migrate, why bother investing in, for example, improved irrigation? So I think what the policy priority really is to encourage migrants to invest knowledge and remittances back into the agricultural sector to facilitate climate change adaptation. But this requires an integrated approach. There needs to be an understanding for the structural barriers which prevented people from investing in these technologies in the first place. But then there also needs to be a recognition that to some extent people are going to migrate anyway due to the strong cultural drive to migrate. So with or without greater resilience, people will migrate. So really the priority is to reduce some of the distress behind the migration decision-making process. That note, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now, Peter, can you tell us about your research on internal migration in Peruvian Amazon?
Yes. Good morning, I'm Peter Cronkleton from the Center for International Forestry Research. I'll be giving a talk that will address internal migration, settlement, and deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon. And the goal of this presentation is to reflect on one of the SDGs, particularly SDG 15, life on land. I won't read the entire definition of this SDG as you can see it here, but this is one of the main SDGs dealing with forest management and land use change. And I'm going to be reflecting on this by drawing examples from research in the Peruvian Amazon. So we'll be discussing migration patterns that were observed in the course of this research, examine some of the associated patterns of land use change that are in these same areas, and then reflect on some of the policy implications observed in these patterns. So this is a recent research project that is going to be concluding this year that we've conducted with funding from the German BMZ in collaboration with the GIZ project, Pro Ambiente in Peru, and in collaboration with Temple University. And it addresses this issue of migration, which is seen as one of the very important drivers of deforestation in Peru. You'll often hear Peruvian authorities citing figures of 80 or 95% of the deforestation in the Amazon being driven by migratory agriculture. However, there's a lack of systematic information about migration patterns, about the characteristics of the migrants, or the actual effects of migration on forests. So we find some of these statements dubious due to the lack of information and the lack of specificity of what the government means by migratory agriculture, and then the lack of specificity of who exactly these actors are. And so there's also a similar narrative, or there's an underlying narrative in these discussions of migration that sees one of the factors being highland populations moving out of the Andes into the Amazon, and due to their lack of familiarity with the environment, causing excessive environmental degradation due to their lack of experience with tropical forests or the capacity of land for their agricultural practices. So based on this phenomena, we think that there's a weak foundation for defining policy actions and strategies to actually address deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon. So our research, we didn't try to characterize all the complexity of the Peruvian Amazon. We just wanted to have a few case studies. So we focused on 4 multi-village landscapes in the Amazon that were purposely selected to include 2 landscape sites that were road sites that were accessible on the road network in the Peruvian Amazon, and 2 landscapes that were on river watersheds that were only accessible by water. So these landscapes were one that we were calling Nishuya, which had been an area of production forest that was invaded in the 1980s. Employees of the logging company stayed in the forest initially to grow coca. This was a no-go zone during the time of Sendero Luminoso, so it was very remote and inaccessible to the government. But in the late 80s and early 90s, drug eradication programs and crop substitution programs came in to pacify this area, and they stabilized the settlement. The Abuhau watershed is an area of more traditional riverine settlements. These are sites that have a long history stretching back to the rubber boom and earlier, actually pre-Columbian settlements probably. But this is an area that was heavily impacted by violence in the late 1980s and 90s during the Sendero Luminoso period. And so much of this area was depopulated for more than a decade. It was only been in the last decade that people have begun to move back and take possession of their communities. The Tornavista landscape is another road site. This is another area with a long history. However, this was an area where there were large parastatal farms that were largely abandoned during the period of violence, then privatized during the time of President Fujimori. But in this transition, many of these areas were invaded by smallholders. And so you have a complex matrix of overlapping property rights and property rights insecurity as a result. And then finally, our third site is an indigenous landscape where we have Shipibo communities with large communal properties. And this is probably the most inaccessible landscape of the places we're looking at. So the Peruvian government looks at migration using 2 main indicators. One is an indicator of birthplace. So when they do the annual every decade do their censuses, they try to take account on where people were born and whether or not they're still located in those areas, often measured at the provincial level, but for some indicators going down to district or community levels to see what shifts have taken place in the population. They also use an indicator of recent migrants, which is a measure of how much people have moved within the past 5 years. So then the question is, where were the migrants in these landscapes that we were working in? We used multiple methods to gather information in these sites. We interviewed over 300 households using a systematic household survey. We conducted 28 focus group interviews with men and women in each of these villages, and then did dozens of key informant interviews to gather information on the dynamics and patterns that were taking place at these sites. And then in collaboration with Temple University, did some remote sensing to try to define some of the land use patterns. So looking at the main migration indicator, you can see that in modern landscapes, almost 3/4 of the people were migrants. And this was a very conservative measure, actually, of looking at just at the provincial level. But there was a lot of diversity across our landscapes, with the exception of the indigenous landscape having the highest percentage of people that were native born to this province. But if you look at recent migrants, there are much fewer migrants show up in these sites. However, you see in the two sites, Nishuya and Abuhao, a roadside and a riverside, that were most impacted by violence in the 80s and 90s, are the locations where you see most recent migrants now. Looking at this indicator in terms of birth pace, you see even a higher percentage of people are migrants. But again, variation across the sites. In some of the landscapes, virtually everybody is a migrant. And then in some of the indigenous sites, for example, you have still a large population of people native to their villages. But this is important then to look at where are these people coming from. And one of the things that's important to point out about migration in Peru is that in the Amazon, most migrants are Amazonian. These aren't people moving in from outside the region, they're people moving within the region. And you can see that this varies across our landscapes. But one of the things also to point out is even though some of the people in some landscapes, like in Tornavista, more than half are coming from the highlands, many of these people have spent most of their lives in the Amazon. So they've migrated with their families as children, and while they still identify or culturally identified as highland people, they're basically another group of Amazonians because they've lived in this environment in their entire lives, or the vast majority of their lives. So you see this phenomenon where you have a high rates of mobility. For the migrants on our sites, more than half of them are almost half of them have moved 3 or more times in their lives while they're moving around in the Amazon. But once they settle, they produce relatively stable settlements. Most of these communities had been started in the 70s and 80s, and many of the informants on average had lived 19 years in these sites. And migrants had lived on average 23 years in the Amazon. So then if we go to land use change, you can see a striking pattern comparing the road sites to the river sites. The lines here, the red line represents the loss of mature forests in the landscapes that we defined in these buffer areas compared to the district as a whole. So you can see in the road sites, these were locations, particularly starting in the 1990s, of increased forest loss. And so these started out with areas that had more than 80% in most cases of their forest cover, then declining rapidly as they go through. This is the Tornavista landscape here on the side. So when you look at then, what is this being replaced with? In these road sites, it's primarily being replaced by agricultural land uses. And you can see again the same comparison of the landscape to the district, as opposed to the river sites where the impact of agriculture and other human uses of these landscapes was minimal. And this is largely the difference between these sites being primarily subsistence agriculture as opposed to commercial agriculture. For example, cacao that was introduced as a crop substitution program in the late 1980s. So then, what does this tell us about the migration patterns in settlement? First of all, occupation was through spontaneous settlement. In all of these sites, all of the 16 villages we visited, these were settled by people moving into forest lands that were targeted for occupation because forests in the Peruvian Amazon are seen as abandoned, unused land. Even though the national government considers it national patrimony, people locally see that as a sign of unused land having forest. So residents would move in and demarcate their properties and in collaboration with their neighbors, trying to define properties that more or less reflected what they thought the government would recognize as property. And then gradually, as settlements coalesce, other state agencies moved in to provide services, build schools, put in health posts, local governments building roads or bridges. So you have this gradual process. And then later, the state would begin formalizing property rights. But they would only formalize property rights where in lands that had been deforested. So you see these sort of perverse incentives. On the one hand, the government resists recognizing these settlements because they see them as invading national forests. On the other hand, only recognizing property rights as legitimate if people have removed the forest. The main drivers of migration in these areas were searches for arable land or searches for economic opportunity in areas where the frontier was closing, where there was no more available land. People were moving in to seek wage labor and agriculture. Forced migration was an issue, but more in the past. And so the migration patterns and outcomes were strongly influenced by national and regional government dynamics. So while the government was interested in protecting forests, other government agencies at the same time had different agendas and were trying to support people living in rural areas. And the link between migration patterns and deforestation were complex. However, infrastructural improvement was associated with forest conversion. So in our point of view, the government blaming deforestation on migrants actually hides the fact that many of these processes are driven or influenced by other decisions made by the government. So in conclusion, the promotion of sustainable land use and forest management should reflect better understanding of the patterns and impacts of demographic change on forest frontiers. And effective policy actions and strategies require better understanding of how existing policy frameworks create the current context, how agendas and actions of different agencies compete or conflict in these landscapes, and how competing policies undermine broader governmental goals and lead to unintended consequences. There's a need to identify shared agendas and increase collaboration and balance trade-offs between government agencies. And then finally, the patterns of internal migration observed in Peru expose the complexity of these processes and the need for a timely evidence for decision support. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Now, Charles, please tell us about your research on forced migration.
Set my clock quickly. And so I'll be talking broadly. I think the slideshow should be, there it is. Thank you. I'll be talking about reducing root causes of forced migration, which is one of two work packages that we're doing at the German Development Institute. The other half of this work package, which is funded by the German Development Ministry, is looking at regional migration patterns and frameworks. And I've heard really interesting things that feed into the work we're doing kind of at a cross-national level from the first two speakers from their cases, and it's interesting patterns we've seen, especially in terms of complexity, the aspects of the environment, aspects of the economy, and potentially violence, which is some of the work that we work on as well. So when we frame the research we're doing, we're primarily political scientists in the division I work in. So we tend to think in terms of how does development cooperation influence patterns of power, patterns of access to resources, patterns of violence. And this is the lens through which we kind of started looking at forced migration as this kind of a multi-dimensional challenge. For me, in my background, something I'm quite interested in is the role of economics and the role of economic access and patterns of economy in people's decision to leave. So we have that on the top right. I have colleagues who work on forced migration and environmental change, so bottom left. Something we look at, though, is how both of these patterns feed into violence. They feed into a lack of security. And then, historically, that lack of security and violence feeds back into increased economic degradation. It feeds back into a lack of access to land. So what we have is this very kind of complex macro-level pattern. And one of the first things we did was we took a look at the data that's being collected on forced migration. One of the key challenges in this research is that data on migration itself tends to either be very micro, or it tends to be extremely macro to the point where it's hard to do inferential analysis with it. But one data set that we were pointed to, it's a project called 4MI. It's a multi-donor project in the Horn of Africa. This visualization is taken right off their website. And what they're actually doing is embedding researchers in the places where people move from the Horn northwest through toward the Mediterranean. And they're doing these rather large interviews with people. And what was interesting was when I thought about what you guys were talking about in terms of land access, economic access, risks of violence, what people were reporting in the push factors was They would leave Eritrea, they would leave Somalia. They're facing a lack of rights, they're facing a lack of economic opportunity, they're facing a lack of social services. And these are all things that are not only functions of someone's household level life, but they're functions of the state, and they're reflected in the state that people come from. And for us, in the work we're doing, the nature of the state as a driver of forced displacement is something we're interested in. Something about the complexity here that I'll point out quickly before the next slide. People could respond to all of these. So what you could very well find is someone left one place because there was violence. Then they left the second place because the work went away. And by the time they were interviewed, they've now left violence, they've left a lack of economic ability to earn a living. And by the time they're interviewed, you have this question of, well, are you a refugee? Or are you an economic migrant? And this is something that's come up in the work we've done, and that specific policy question. So for us, when I mentioned attributes of the state, one thing we look at, and my colleague Jörn Gravingholt is the one who came up with the concept on the left, is rethinking state fragility as a driver of forced migration or forced displacement. Historically, state fragility, I would say if you looked 20 years ago, was basically a measure of, are you poor and at war? And if you are, you're fragile, otherwise you're not. The concept has evolved quite a lot. And the way we think of it at the German Development Institute is it's the nature of the state. And the nature of the state for us is defined by authority, the ability to keep the space within your borders safe, capacity, so the ability to deliver public services, to deliver collective goods, and legitimacy. Does the population view the government as legitimate? Does it respect their rights? And there's a number of ways these are measured. They're passed through a statistical program. And what you get are 6 types of fragility, 6 types of countries. And in our case, what we're looking at is perhaps in low-capacity countries, and we have some initial data that says a lot of people tend to leave low-capacity countries at about the same, if not a higher rate than completely dysfunctional countries. And dysfunctional basically means you're having a civil war. So these attributes of the state that go well beyond violence are fairly key indicators, and there are places where development cooperation can fit in. But I think going even farther, you have efforts like the Global Compact on Migration. And when I said earlier, a migrant might be moving because they fled violence, then they had to keep moving because they couldn't find a job. What is that person? The Refugee Convention probably wouldn't treat them as a refugee, depending on how the receiving country decides to code them when they arrive. You could very well say they're an economic migrant, and that's that. On the other side, was this not a person fleeing violence initially who deserves some kind of protection? The legal space around emerging patterns of forced displacement, especially in the work we're doing in the Horn of Africa and West Africa, has created some very challenging legal gray areas. And to use development cooperation or to sign on to the Global Compact means dealing with very challenging domestic politics, which I put in the background. That's from Estonia. It was a protest against new arrivals. And that is a very general problem that we're facing right now and that the ministry is aware of too. So I was asked to kind of frame this as, how does SDG 17 fit in? And SDG 17, as I view it, is a mechanism for these multidimensional responses, reinvigorating multidimensional approaches, regional approaches, not only to migration itself and migration management as its own policy space, but thinking about addressing drivers of forced displacement. So if you look at something like zero poverty, zero hunger, or inequalities between states, that's not something a single state can actually do. So 17 really is the thrust that pushes us toward dealing with these drivers that, when they mix, become quite complex. There's also regional migration coordination and policy coordination. 2 of my colleagues are doing quite a bit of comparative work on how IGAD in East Africa and ECOWAS in West Africa are comparatively managing within region migration. And it's a really important question in large part because most migration happens either within countries or within regions. Very few people actually go from IGAD region to Europe. Most of the migration happens in Africa where we're working. This is probably one of the most challenging spaces to look at, and I think it's partly because the politics tend to say, how do we use development cooperation to stop migration? And I think this is probably the worst direction you can possibly go with the discussion because you can't stop migration. People are going to move. The empirical evidence for as long as I've looked back is that mobility is just what happens in our world, and it's just going to happen more. I think on the flip side, you can't merely just throw open borders. I don't think we can move to a borderless world. And for me, the perspective is when we think about reimagining a global migration framework or regional migration frameworks, if you're a receiving state, you have a responsibility to providing protection and to making sure that someone's human rights are met. So I think in many ways, if you make an argument that people arriving should be provided services, should be provided support, you do need some kind of control. You do need some kind of migration management strategy. So the SDGs in themselves provide a framework for dealing with the drivers of forced displacement within themselves, and 17 is your partnership vehicle. Without dealing with those drivers, you're going to have what we're seeing now, which is these huge mixed migration flows and survival migration flows, to borrow a phrase from Alex Betts. And the compacts, I think, provide the vehicle for policy planning within the 2030 agenda. They provide a vehicle for pursuing the global compacts. And I think without regional efforts, without global efforts, we're just going to struggle because these problems and these challenges are far too large for an individual country to manage. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all presenters for fascinating presentations. Now we will invite our discussants. Okay, so we have two broad topics, and then there are two sets of discussions. Now we have like 3 discussions, so maybe you move a little bit so we provide like some room for the discussion to be here. Okay, please welcome Paula Agostini, Fabian Smith-Pramov, Lampat Parisina, please. Paula Agostini is the global lead for forest, landscape, and ecosystem at the World Bank and the team leader for the Burundi Landscape Restoration Program. In the last 20 years and in different positions at the World Bank, she has been working on analytical work at the interface of environment and agriculture and at the synergies between public and private sector in both Africa and Latin America. Fabian is an advisor at GIZ with considerable background in areas of forest and climate change, REDD+, and forest financing. Prior to joining GIZ in 2009, he worked for 3 years in private sector, mainly for innovative forest investment in Central America, in Costa Rica and Panama. And Lampat Parisina, youth representative from South Rift Association of Land Owners in Kenya, which is an association of Maasai pastoralists who collectively manage their land. So let's start from Paula. What do you think about the range of research that was presented today, and how might the findings and recommendations be useful for like World Bank operations?
Thank you very much. I just want also to clarify that I was the global lead until a few months ago, and now I moved into working on Europe and Central Asia as a primary responsibility at the World Bank. So having said that, I want to mention that one important link I think was missing in the presentation, and I think it's of a major interest for the World Bank, which is the link with climate change, migration and the climate change issues, because we are at this conference related to landscape restoration, right, and forest. So the World Bank has done in just a few months ago, six months ago more or less, has issued a very important report that is called the Groundswells, and it's looking at the issues of climate change and internal migration. And basically, the findings are that if we don't consider climate change issues, internal migrants can become really the major issues, and between now and 2050, only in 3 regions of the work, we will have more than 140 million internal migrants. And this is looking at Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. And the major causes of that related to climate change are, of course, the decrease in crop productivity, the shortage of water that will come because of climate change, and the sea level rise. So, I'm just trying to bring the issues to what our conference Global Landscape Forum it is. And, but the good news is that, well, we can take actions and really strongly reduce this kind of impacts. And this report went into very strong details about 3 cases like Ethiopia, which you mentioned a lot, the Horn of Africa, Bangladesh, and Mexico. So there are different recommendations for that. But basically, also, one important element is to look at some if we don't do anything, there will be some important hotspot, both of out migration and in migration. So what can be done, it's really related to some kind of including migration issues and climate change issues into development planning. And then also, sometimes migration can be a good adaptation strategy. So that should be recognized. In terms of the actions the World Bank is doing, which are also related to what our presenters have presented, is we have a new financing for looking at refugees. It's in the World Bank fund is called IDA, and there is a window in the IDA 18, which is really for refugees issues, and especially for the countries that are receiving the refugees, so that they can have a special additional funding to reduce the conflict, to include more the incoming refugees. We are really working a lot on that in all the zone of the Great Green Wall, which is going from Senegal all the way to Ethiopia, where we are trying to work on increasing the productivity of the land through restoring the degraded lands of the Sahara and the Sahel, and include also these issues of migrations. We are doing it in countries like Uganda, but even, I'm just coming back from Burundi. I came back yesterday morning from Burundi, a huge IDA 18 window for refugees coming from our countries. So we are working on it, and we are also working in including, in working not only on the natural resource side of the equation, but also on trying to increase the competitiveness of a territory, of a landscape in its total, so that if you have less degraded land, but also you increase its competitiveness, young people will actually be more proud and happy to live in their own land, and really that territorial approach will help in reducing the migration. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. And now, Fabian, in your view, how can the research that Peter presented today inform Peru policy and on forest and natural resource management? And what about GIZ operation in Peru?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the very interesting presentations, and also for your comments. I think we are all on the same line. We see the need to look at these issues, and maybe a little clarification. So GIZ is the German government company implementing most of the technical cooperation of the German government, both for the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and for the Ministry of Environment, while the financial cooperation is implemented by KfW. So I was partly involved in the Peruvian research. I just came back from Peru after a few years there, and this topic of migration is highly relevant, especially when talking about forest landscapes, when talking about REDD+, because the assumptions that Peter showed at the policy level are really that the main drivers of deforestation in Peru are poverty-driven migration, and looking at the research results, I think at least at these sites, it became apparent that this assumption or this story of poverty-driven migration and deforestation is not true in these villages or in these places. And looking at the title of the session, I'm wondering, we're talking about managing migration and remittances. And maybe this is a question to all the presenters, like who is actually managing the landscapes we're talking about? Looking at these villages, like just the Rio Pisci, the villages there, it takes you 1 day from Pucallpa, the regional hub, to reach the village. And I've stayed several days in this village, met very interesting people, heard many stories. And the same story that they tell you is, we don't have state presence here. There is no permanent state presence. The state is coming for a visit. So I was sitting one night in the local pub, which was basically a wooden hut where we had chicken and drank some beer. And there were two people from the state that got to know each other. There was a person from the Ministry of Education who was in the village to give a training to the teachers about new training methods. And there was an auditor of the National Forest Concession Authority who was basically auditing or looking at what is happening in forest concessions on the way to another village down the river. And they exchanged numbers and they said, hey, let's collaborate because it's so hard to get here. Next time we take the boat together. So I think it's really important to think about like these collaborative approaches and to ask like who's really managing the landscape and what is the state role, because the Ministry of Education guy, he's providing a service. And the forestry guy, he wants to control. He wants to make sure that people obey to the rules. And I think this is something we should always keep in mind when talking about management of landscapes and also talking about migration. So an aspect that I would like to learn more from Peter is like, what is the financial flow? Like you talked about remittances and mainly covered the forest impact. And the stories I heard in these villages is often that the forest landscapes provide also an income to urban family members. So they finance the education of their kids with the income of the forest. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind to tell a positive story, that forests can actually also provide a good income.
Okay, thank you, Fabian, for your feedbacks. We will let later the presenters to respond, but now I give the floor for Lampard to tell about like that migration is actually like issues that your community is facing every day. So can you tell us more about that?
Thank you very much. And also would like to thank all the presenters for the evidence that they provide through research. But I think to give justice to the audience, I would like again to introduce myself, Parashina from Kenya, from the Maasai community, and we are in the south of Kenya. We share our community transverse across Kenya and Tanzania, so it's quite a cross-border community. And when you speak about migration, then I think we are always migrating year in, year out in search of water and pasture. But the context on which we need to define migration is also something that we need to think about. Kenya generally faces a lot of migration, and I think Charles is doing some work in Kenya. We have a lot of migrants from Somalia, where they have been facing civil war for more than the last 2 decades. So we have an issue of refugees. But to contextualize this discussion to the community level and in terms of internal migration, for us as a community, we realize that, and this goes again to what Charles was discussing, the issue of fragility. You know, it's a landscape that is very fragile. It's a landscape that is affected a lot by drought. For the last 2 decades, we have experienced serious and severe droughts to an extent that an entire family loses completely the herd, and that is the livelihood, and that's what it depends on. So back in 2005, between 2000 and 2004, we discussed as a community then, what do we need to do? Because our land, our productivity, our livelihood is quite dependent on our landscape, on the connectivity between us as communities. So we brought together 16 different group ranches. For those who know the land, in Kenya, we have community land, which was before 2010, they were considered as group ranches. This is areas of land that communities utilize communally as a community, and they have one ownership. It's owned by the community. So after realizing that, we knew that we need to do something as a community, and the only thing we could have done is to amalgamate our resources. As fragile as the land is, we had to come together and see how do we provide pastures for our livestock, water for our livestock as a community, so that when this community is suffering, then you can get help from the other. But again, to put this to a global context on partnership, what we need to do is that we need partnership, not patronage. You don't need to get solutions that are discussed and try to be negotiated only on high levels, on national and international levels. But we need the involvement of communities. We need communities to be taken as serious stakeholders in terms of trying to implement these actions, because so long as the communities are not involved, so long as the people who are actually on the ground are not involved, and they are the one facing the serious livelihood challenges, they will still have to move because they are not part of the solutions. So I think we need to focus on bringing solutions at the community level so as to create some sort of livelihood, give the youth and the young people a reason to stay on their landscapes and not to move in search of other better pastures out there, which others are becoming very dangerous from the recent international news that we get from West Africa trying to get into Europe. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the 3 discussions. So now I give to each presenter time for 2 minutes to respond to any of the input from the discussions. Start from Charles.
Okay. There we go. So the IDA 18 to refugees issue, I would ask, is that connected to what the IFC was doing in Kakuma camp in Kenya? Because if so, something I've seen that's really interesting with the IFC and the World Bank, and I think the IMF was involved, was shifting the focus from camps as kind of humanitarian emergency spaces to taking a city planning strategy and understanding camps as places where people establish livelihoods, they set up businesses. And I think this kind of process feeds into a resource management question, an environmental question, because if you see something as a city, you're going to think rather differently about how you manage the collective resources. And in a place like Kakuma, as far north and west as it is, and as hot and dry as it can be, or conversely, too wet, this kind of resource management is quite critical. So I have seen definitely the World Bank taking what I think is a really innovative approach to thinking about, what do we do with these long-term camps? And then this question of who manages these settings, I think is a really good question, and I think it feeds into something I've seen in Kenya, in Tana Delta. Again, a region which is mixed farming and cattle. And what you tend to have is either serious drought, which leads to conflict over land and space, or the last time I was there, again, too much water. So the whole place was flooded, and I think the Garissa Dam broke. So there was way too much water. And what was interesting was talking with the county authority, they said, all we can do is watch all this water come in and evaporate. We just don't have the capacity to make use of it effectively. And I think that's a space where the state, the county, and donors, and the communities themselves can play a really interesting and valuable integrated role going forward.
Thank you. Fraser, please.
Yeah, I can respond briefly to particularly the comment on climate change and migration. I mean, I think in the likes of countries such as Nepal and the wider South Asian region, I mean, of course, climate change is a significant driver of migration, but it's also not a kind of straightforward relationship. It's a kind of convergence of both climatic pressures as well as economic pressures, as well as cultural changes as well. And facilitating adaptation to climate change can sort of, I don't think it will stop migration, but it will possibly reduce some of the stress behind the decision-making process. You know, so I mean, people in areas such as like the Gangetic Plain, such as the lowland part of Nepal, northern Indian states of Bihar, a lot of the seasonal migration is, you know, linked very strongly to climate. If they have a particularly bad year, then they'll migrate for, you know, for 9 months of the year. If it's a good year, then they'll migrate for just 4 to 5 months. But when it comes to the kind of migration to the Gulf, which is predominant in Nepal and also in Bangladesh and a lot of other parts of South Asia, then I think there's not really a clear-cut link between migration and climate change. I mean, it's become very much a cultural process. It's almost a rite of passage. When you reach, you know, 16, 17, you apply for a passport, you go abroad and come back. But another kind of consideration is in terms of the adaptation to climate change for those who stay behind is one of the biggest challenges, particularly for women in sort of feminized agricultural sector. A lot of women struggle to get access to irrigation resources to help cope with climate change because traditionally it's men who have always been in charge of the irrigation sector, and then when men go outside, and a lot of the donor programs are still sort of focused on, traditionally they will go to the men or men will come to the meetings. It hasn't really caught up with this change. And women often face difficulties, you know, in getting access to the paperwork if they want, for example, to get a tube well installed or such like. And women are also more vulnerable to climate change as well, because often when the men were living locally, then they would be, you know, there would be a regular injection of cash into the household because, you know, men would be doing casual labor and such like in the bazaar or nearby. However, once the men leave, then suddenly it might be 2 years before they see any money. The first year they're paying off the loan, and then the 1 year they'll only get money on a sort of sporadic basis. So then if there is a drought, I've seen situations where there's been a severe drought in Bihar in North India. A lot of the women were then forced to go and do extremely low-wage labor for landlords, often at, you know, up to sort of, you know, 50 cents a day, because they had no choice, basically. So yeah, so I think you need to consider those who stay behind, particularly when talking about climate change.
Okay, thank you, Fraser. Now, Peter, your 2 minutes start from now.
Does it sound okay? I'll try to respond to each of the discussants. I think I agree that climate change is a key issue here, and I think it was probably underlying the presentations we gave. In the Peru case, deforestation is seen as one of the key drivers and is part of the country's national mitigation program. But the programs don't focus on these sorts of landscapes. These people are seen as illegitimate users. So the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment is very hesitant to work in these areas and to provide any sorts of programs, and with a somewhat legitimate concern that they would, supporting these sorts of communities would expand settlement further into forest areas. But as Fabian pointed out, other ministries and other agencies don't have any problems and actually have a mandate to work with these people. You have the crop substitution programs that are trying to eradicate coca production that invest millions of dollars in these landscapes, providing resources and incentives to convert land to cacao and other types of services. They're not concerned about, they have a goal very specifically about eradicating coca production. The Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health have very specific agenda points on providing services to rural people. And they work at that, and they don't consult the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Forestry about whether or not these are legitimate communities. These are people that are part of their target population, and they provide them services. And so you have this disjuncture between what some ministries are trying to do and the way they treat these forest landscapes, and seeing it as trying to restrict access and trying to provide or present or implement models and mechanisms that will restrict people's access and uses, whereas other agencies have very specific agendas to provide services, as we were discussing yesterday. And so I think there's this lack of understanding of these sorts of dynamics and this inability to step outside of official frameworks to come up with innovative solutions because of that. And I think people living in these landscapes as a result suffer because they face restrictions on one hand and limited opportunities because of the models that the state is using to define their landscapes.
Okay, thank you, Peter. It seems like you need longer discussion, but for this, we can do it after the session. But now we would like to invite more discussions. So since the chair is limited, we request the presenter to come down here because we are talking about what is the suggestion for future research. So maybe the presenter would like to take some notes. Okay, we welcome Aileen Mairena, Nur Higiati Rahayu, and Dorothy Pio. So Aileen Mairena is an indigenous mosquito and anthropologist from Nicaragua, currently working for Center for the Autonomy and Development Indigenous People as a researcher and advocacy officer on climate finance and territorial governance. She has extensive participatory research work on the various indigenous people in Latin America on management of natural resources and territorial construction for self-governance. Ibu Nur Higiati Rahayu, Ibu Yuke, is the Director of Forestry and Water Resource Conservation at the Ministry of National Development Planning in Indonesia. Her role is to coordinate, formulate, monitor, and to evaluate policy, national development plan, and strategy on forestry and water resource conservation. Dorothy Pio is a biodiversity finance specialist, conservation finance and enterprise team of the Flora and Fauna. Dorothy work focused on creating a direct link between healthy forests and improved well-being of the forest-dependent communities, and on providing financial incentive for avoided or reduced deforestation through payment for ecosystem services and REDD+. So thank you for being here. So the question is actually first for Aileen. How can the research on migration and sustainable development be useful for the advocacy that you do for the indigenous people major group in Latin America, and what the new question researchers should focus on?
Thank you. Good morning to everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Because I can bring here the voices of the indigenous people. First of all, I think the issues of migration are very complex. If you put the indigenous people aspect in this issue, are a little bit more complex. So for us, migration have different causes. I think you already present some of these, but that these also bring other issues to our discussion. Because for us, migration is not only driven because there is, we migrate for cultural reasons also. We migrate because we have big enterprise going into our lands and territory, and then we lost our ownership of our lands, so we have to migrate. Sometimes there is a violation of our indigenous collective rights. So there is a lot of other issues that I think could be part of research and are very important to know how to deal with the migration of indigenous people and how to deal with this process of land restoration in our lands and territories, because you have to know, and I think most of you know, the indigenous territory are the areas where we have the biggest biodiversity in all the world. So if we deal with migration and we have the problem of these areas could be are more vulnerable for for others to come to our lands and have changes negative to the environment. But we have to know also that migration and for us, the land is not just an economic space. For us, the land is our mother. For us, the lands is the center of our lam and laka. In my language is our well-being. So it's not just a process of economical in our country, even some people believe that and work like that in the institution. But that's why it's important to take all the information, to acknowledge, to recognize the importance of the indigenous knowledge to the land restoration. And we think that it's important when we talk about land restoration and we talk about research, we think that you have to talk about land rights security. That is one of the biggest issues for us. You have to take into account the traditional knowledge, the knowledge of the indigenous people. And we think that it's important the indigenous people be part of this process, not just to be the object. I think you already said, we don't want to be a beneficiary or an actor. We want to be a driver of change in all this process. So we have to be, we are researchers also. There's a lot of indigenous that do research, but we don't work in CIFOR or SIGIA, I don't know, in other institutions. So most of our investigation or research are not taken into account to this process, even if we have important issues to say about. So, but I think other thing that is important to take into account is that in this migration process, the indigenous women, the youth, the children are very vulnerable because they are vulnerable when we lost this relation with the nature, with the land, we lost the ownership, we lost our cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. So, Ibu Yuke, the feedback that we have received so far are from development organization and advocacy organization. So with your position in the Ministry of National Development Planning, what kind of additional issues would you add from the government perspective?
Thank you. Before what I heard lots, and then it's applicable to Indonesia, and in the same case in Indonesia is the one that raised by, I think, by Peter in the Peruvian case, and also Fabian emphasized on that, is this is the case of when migrants to the forest areas, that the case is whether we would like to approach with the access in law enforcement on the entering the forest area, or for the humanity responsible for them. So in the case of Indonesia, actually in external migrants, for my knowledge, is not related to the forest, but internal migration, it is really related to forest. So whether both cases, whether people entered the forest area or now people left the forest because of migrant urbanization. So it's really in the case. And then what's really now we try to solve with the problem of the migrants, and then people now using the forest area, what we call it's not illegally. And we already tried to solve the problem using the Agrarian reform. But again, the problem of the migrant is not only the economic aspects, but because of the social aspects. It's not easy just to solve the problem with using the land allocation and providing the rights to access. But it's more modern because it's complex, and I think that's really the important what we need to look at again, the researcher, how we solve the conflict area, the forest conflicts using the agrarian reforms. Our target is quite high, and until now it's quite difficult to achieve. And as this is quite a burden for also the forestry sectors, as well as how the people can live when they really rely on the forest products.
Thank you, Ibu. Now, Dorothy, your work on financing for biodiversity and conservation and the SDGs recognize remittance as one of the main ways of mobilizing resource for financing sustainable development. What would you be your suggestion for new research that researchers could consider focusing, and that maybe will be useful for your work that you do?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers. I really enjoyed all of the talks and found them, as Ibu Yuke just said, very relevant to Indonesia's context. I'm thinking very much in terms of the pressures of migration on deforestation, because that's the landscape I'm familiar with. In particular, it's sort of central south Sumatra, around a national park called the Kerinci Seblat National Park, which is a very important national park, UNESCO listed, and in the buffer zone of the national park and in the national park itself, there's a lot of pressure from migrants coming from the southern part of the island, so national migration, as Ibu Yuke was saying, which is sort of encroaching in the national park, and for coffee plantations mainly. So that's my that's how I'm approaching this, that's how I'm thinking about this. Also, sort of the way I'm thinking about it is that as part of my work, I'm facilitating, or not me, but the Indonesian team is facilitating sort of diversification of local livelihoods in villages in this landscape, to kind of shift the model from an extractive to a sort of a less extractive model that doesn't require deforestation to improve well-being. And that's sort of just to explain where I'm coming from. And then what I wanted to say is I was really interested to know about, in the first talk, in terms of the impacts of roads on sort of socially and economically. I hadn't considered that actually economically there could be negative repercussions of road construction. What I've always been thinking about are the negative consequences of road construction on forests and sort of the illegal wildlife trade and that sort of thing. So I think, number one, that it would be really interesting to understand in more depth and perhaps combine, and I'm not sure if this body of work already exists or not, but combine environmental and social consequences of road construction. This is a very big issue all over the world. So I think that could be a significant impact in terms of policy. And then more generally, I just think the key is land use planning and bringing together stakeholders and understanding how to create synergies and overlaps between different government bodies, different stakeholders in the landscape, and essentially sort of thinking about timing and relationship building between the researchers and the people who are going to use the research. So that, and in particular, I'd say a focus on how to diversify income, how to diversify local economies in the landscapes of origin, that in my mind, and understanding that in more depth is going to have really big impacts for the kind of landscape I'm thinking about and reducing deforestation rates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. So now we will answer some questions that already we received from Slido. Can we show the questions? We invite all the panelists to stand up behind the discussions, because like I see the question is like for some also the discussion. So, okay. We don't have really, yeah, that's you. But it's like, the question like first is, we hear the negative consequence, but is there more that can be said about the opportunities that migration offers for the environment and development? Okay.
Okay.
1 minute, yeah?
Yeah, let
okay.
me try. So, when in our studies that we have done on internal migrations, we looked at the fact that sometimes really the ecosystem cannot support all these people or all these livestock. And migration is a perfectly acceptable adaptation strategy. So in that sense, you know, migrating to urban area is maybe the best solution, because if we think that both the livestock is going to increase and put more pressure and the people are going to increase, really this ecosystem, like in the Sahel, are not, the carrying capacity is just not enough. So really, this can be a perfectly acceptable strategy.
Okay, Peter, can you add 1 more minute?
Well, I think, yeah, I would agree. I think you see that these locations where you have people being drawn into areas where there is infrastructure, schools, and services, you then are releasing pressures in other areas, in some very biodiverse areas that are important. As you have people moving out of remote lands and moving into accessible areas, there is a beneficial consequence in some cases. A perverse result of some of the violent conflicts that you see around the world is there actually is good for forest restoration. I don't think anyone would promote that, but it's one of the aspects you see occur in these areas as you have population shift out of areas because it's not viable either just as a human presence or for economic conditions. You do have these sorts of benefits. So it's one thing to think about, and I agree, don't think of migration and these shifts as just negative terms. Governments can influence how people are moving or influence how these patterns are working to try to provide better services, but also then to release pressure in areas that they would like to have more conservation.
Okay, thank you, Peter. We move to the second questions. In Nepal, I met ex-migrants who took from badly paid labor in Dubai. They then start to look for better agriculture labor at home. Is there any trend? Is there a trend of such returnees? I think it's like maybe Fraser, you can answer.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really good question. I didn't really have time to go into it in detail in the presentation, but there are instances of returnees. Sometimes, you know, who'll invest in, you know, like high value sort of commercial agriculture or cash crop production. One of the field sites we worked in the Eastern Hills, the one I showed actually in the slide, they actually had started Rudraksha cultivation, which is a sort of seed which is used for religious purposes mostly in India and China, and it's very, very high value, and it doesn't require much labor as well. But there's always a flip side to that. So those who have returned are generally often the ones who've already got some land and capital at home, so often they have, you know, their own land, they'll maybe have good social networks, and they have the ability to reinvest their remittances productively. You also have a lot of people who return in a much worse state, often in significant debt, people who have returned who have not got the job that they've been promised or have lost their job or have become injured, and they actually return in a much worse situation. So, you know, there's polarized outcomes, and I think you need to have some awareness of the kind of the class structure, essentially, and that every migrant, the richer people as well as the poorer people in villages are migrating, but they're migrating to do different kinds of work, and this often reflects the kind of opportunities when they come home.
Okay. Thank you, Fraser. Then we have question to Paula Agostini. What is the status of GGW in Eastern Africa? Is it only on the paper, or is there significant physical progress? How is the World Bank involved?
Yes. Okay, so GGW, the Great Green Wall Initiative. It's a fantastic dream. Is this what I was saying to you, stop the advance of the desert from Senegal all the way to Ethiopia? Many agencies are involved and many donors and of course the governments, etc. It's a project, a program that I think will last, an entire life. Because of the size and the complexity. But we do have some great results. In East Africa, especially in Ethiopia, more than 800,000 hectares have been now restored and brought back into productive landscape through, thanks to the work of a Great Green Wall. In Niger, I don't know how many of you were at the presentation yesterday of the Africa 100, there are 4 or 5 million hectares that have been restored for farmer-managed natural regenerations. So it's incredible results as well there. But if you look in terms of the total number of hectares that are still needed, this is just a small size. Having said that, I mean, I think that if we think about it as a long-term, really long-term, lifelong program, I think that we will see great results.
Okay, thank you, Paula. And Charles, there is a question about, you use term migration and displacement interchangeably. Are they actually the same thing? Maybe you can clarify that.
So when I practiced my presentation, I was going to stick with migration. I think the best laid plans came into effect. There's a lot of literature about this debate. And I think this hits at a challenge we're facing right now on the migration policy side is categorization. I would imagine any lawyer would say categorization is important. As a political scientist, I would say categorization is important because it's how we count and measure. In the eyes of the law, I would say my experience is that there isn't a difference. It tends to be, you know it if you see it. At least in the political science literature, I would say displacement has a strong trend toward being associated with fleeing violence. I would say forced migration, as it's been treated in the political science literature, is probably a broader sense of moving away from an environmental threat or shortfall or an economic shortfall. That would probably be the best answer I could give about those. So in this case, I would say what we're talking about, we're looking more at forced migration. And then I think in some cases you could look in the literature and make an argument that it's displacement. Maybe an easy way to think of it would be, how serious is the shock? How long term are we talking about? A cyclone hits and you're displaced. If you can't recover from the cyclone and you have to move away, that's more forced migration perhaps. This is a question that I think is really key to deal with, and it's also something that's being addressed in the global compacts as well as these questions of definition going forward.
Okay, thank you, Charles. And thank you for all of you who already sent us the questions. I think we only have time to answer these few questions. Now we will have like 1 minute for each panelist here to talk about the key takeaway messages that you want to share with each other or with audience outside there. We maybe like start from Dorothy.
I guess my message is, how can your research, I think you're completely on the right path, and how can you serve and support as best you can the governments that you're, in the countries that you're working with, and synchronize results with strategic budgetary processes and land use planning processes at the national and local government level.
Ibu Yuka, please.
Yeah. Natural resources are very important, and then we cannot just use the term to protect natural resources, but not to see what the people needs quite a lot for the livelihood. So it's we really need to have the resources support the policy making in term how to harmonize that the utilizing of the natural resources for the human, for the livelihoods.
Ellen, please.
Thank you. I just want to add that we, the indigenous people, we are bearer of rights, and we own much of the natural resources in the world. So if you want to work in environmental issues, if you want to work in landscape restoration, it's important not just to include, but give full participation to the indigenous people, indigenous youth, the woman, because we already are doing some of these issues in our communities without governmental programs, but we need more help for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Lampard.
Thank you. I think for me, basically goes back to what Charles was presenting and in focusing on partnerships. I think I would like the global society and those involved in managing migration and looking at issues of livelihoods to try and even in research to look at how can we capacity build the communities to increase their adaptive capacity to the challenges of climate change, the challenges of serious economic times, through basically looking at issues of training and education, to train and educate the young people on landscape productivity and to be able to earn a living out of or from their own landscape instead of looking at ways to move out and go into other areas and other landscapes. Teach them, train them on diversification within their landscape, having to focus on synergizing the traditional knowledge and the rich and diverse cultures that these communities have, these young people have, but to be able to produce at their own landscape level. Thank you.
Thank you. Fabian, please.
Yeah, I'm in the comfortable position to add to all these good points. So, yeah, I think we all realize that migration is a key topic for the future of all of us, not only here in the room. And yeah, yesterday there was a book launch of the book Transforming Red Plus. I think we also have to think about transforming the research we're doing, because all the presentations were done by people from the Northern Hemisphere, and I think we have to work collaboratively and integrate and work together with the domestic researchers and put these topics on the research agendas together with the colleagues in the countries, because we do a lot of research on understanding the complexities of what is happening, a lot of backward-looking research, but I think more and more we have to think about how can we do more forward-looking research, looking how countries, regions, whatever, manage these topics and learn from those. I think that will be very important.
Thank you. Paola, please.
Thank you. Okay, my message is really take climate change and landscape degradation, migration issues into account into development planning. Look at the possibility of investing in a territory, in a landscape to make it more competitive, and make sure that young people, especially young people, are then really proud of their territory, so that they are not going to migrate because they think that I don't know, this is somewhere else is more interesting. What they have is very interesting. They're proud of their culture, they're proud of their territory, and they actually attract people to come there as visitors. Thank you.
Thank you. Fraser, please.
Yeah, I think just to sum up, I think what's come apparent across all the presentations is there's actually some quite very, very diverse narratives about the impact of migration on agriculture and natural resource management. On the one hand, there's this idea that in migration causes deforestation, out migration causes the abandonment of landscape, the breakdown in forest management and such like. Or then there's the sort of positive stories that migration, it can reduce pressure on landscapes, it can bring money in and such like. I think the reality is it's a bit of both, and it's very, very context specific. And what I think we really need to do is we need to engage in interdisciplinary research to understand both the biophysical as well as economic pressures on landscapes and how these link to the migration economy. But it also needs to engage both, moving beyond kind of rational choice assumptions about migration decisions and investment decisions, and looking also at some of the cultural drivers, the cultural attachments to landscapes. There's also the cultural drive to migrate as well, the kind of youth culture which sees people aspiring to particular forms of modern lifestyles.
Okay, thank you. Peter, please.
Yeah, I would agree. I think some of the broader generalizations about migration and its different forms and the impacts it has have been made for some time. And these aren't new revelations emerging out of this research right now. But some of the details that are coming out of this new research, I think, is looking at this complexity and our understanding of complexity, and is contributing to a dialogue that is seeing problem solving as more of an iterative approach, that you take into account specific contexts and locations and look for innovative approaches that respond to those specific types of variables as they appear.
Please, Charles.
Well then, I think the last simple thing I would sign off with is migration is inevitable. I don't think I've seen an example of a time in human history where humans haven't been on the move. And I think it's going to be even more inevitable as we go into the 21st century. So to just riff off this question about how are labor migrants better protected, I think one of the key things going forward, whether it's climate or economic or safety and security, is we're going to increasingly need global models for migration management and a human rights grounded approach to developing these.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists. So it seems like we need like a greater collaboration, because like migration is very big topic, and then it also then linking with the climate change. But now, thank you, big applause please for all of our panelists. And I hand over to Christopher to closing this discussion forum.
Oops, sorry, wake you up. Just to wrap this up very quickly, we're a bit over time. I'd like to, first of all, thank the presenters and the panelists for a really dense round of debate and discussion and presentation with lots of data. I think we need that. I like particularly the comments saying migration is basically a human condition. We can't say migration is bad. We're here in Europe, so it's become a very negative connotation, but I think we need to get back to the facts. And actually, probably if I would ask to raise the hands who is a migrant in this room, probably half of you would raise your hands. Yeah, maybe you can do that, including myself. We are also talking about ourselves, and not all of it is bad. Some of it is opportunity driven, and I think that's good, and that's bringing the world together also. And we have also, in part of our project, we have learned that sometimes migrants that come back also bring back more opportunities. They open the horizon and so on. So it's not all bad, and I think we need to get to better insights into this. And this session certainly was part of this learning. I'd like to thank also Kartika for the wonderful moderation. I hope you agree with me. Yeah. And finally, we have somebody sitting here and taking notes, Julie Mullins, our blogger. So she's going to write a blog about this. And those of you that gave us your contact details and Slido, we'll be reaching, and others, we'll be reaching out to you and let you know about the blog, and maybe you feel encouraged to write some comments underneath. So we keep going in this discussion. Hope to see you in the future here. Thank you very much.